Welcome to Truckee Talks. I'm Maya Schneider, and today we're talking about air quality in Truckee, something we may take for granted, and it may not be as clean as we would like to think it is. With us here on the show are Dwayne Hall from Truckee Town staff, a town planner, and Joe Fish. And Joe, if I've got this right, you're with the Northern Sierra Air Quality Management District?
Yes, ma'am.
Tell me what that is. I'm not familiar with that.
The Northern Sierra Air Quality Management District is a three-county agency that enforces air pollution laws, both state and local and some federal.
Okay.
We are what's called a special district.
And the strictest law supersedes if state law were tougher than federal?
Our local laws are allowed to be more restrictive than state and federal, but never less restrictive.
Okay. All right, good. And Dwayne, what is your role in air quality here in town?
Well, the town planning department, and working together with the air quality district, is preparing an air quality management plan for particulate matter in the town of Truckee. And this is a joint venture between the district and the town, since we both recognize particulate matter as a serious pollution problem.
Okay, now let's talk about particulate matter. In doing some research for the show, the verbiage came up a lot, and I'm not familiar with what that is. We've talked about it a little bit off camera, but if you can, either one of you, tell us what particulate matter is.
Well, particulate matter is like a piece of dust, and you think about it, but what we concentrate on is PM10, which is particulate matter 10 microns in diameter or less. So that's a really small piece of dust. I think Dwayne has a graphic that demonstrates that. And the reason we're concerned about those particles is because those particles are respirable. They get down into the deepest parts of the lungs and literally clog up your lungs over a period of time. You know how you go up into your attic and you work in the attic and it's real dusty and you blow your nose and you see all this dust? Well, those are the very large particles. Those are not PM10. And your body's capable of filtering out those large particles. But the PM10 bypasses the mucus, the cilia, and gets right into the lungs and interferes with gas exchange.
Well, let's talk about that graphic then, if we can get that up on screen, because I was really startled by the difference in the size of what we call particulate matter, and just as compared to the size of, say, a period in the end of a sentence of a typed letter or a piece of hair. So if we can get that graphic up, we'll show you that the large circle that's on the screen is the period at the end of a sentence on a typed letter. The slash next to it is the width of a human hair, and then if you go all the way to the corner of your screen and you see that little tiny dot, that's PM10?
Correct.
That's what we're looking at. Okay, so that is small, and that we're talking about respiratory problems when we have that kind of
Correct.
pollution. Okay. What are some particulate matter issues for Truckee? Are we exceeding standards here? Or?
In the past, Truckee has exceeded the national standard, and it regularly exceeds the state standard.
And what are some contributing factors to that?
We believe that it's two main sources of pollution are wood stoves and windblown dust. And what the exact proportion of their contributions are varies depending on the time of year and the weather conditions. So it's both of those are issues.
Now we do have another graphic, and we'll flip to that pretty quick here, because that graphic really demonstrates in comparison to a fire. Now we were looking at the El Dorado National Forest Fire of '92 and comparing that on this graphic to a typical January day in Truckee, and we see some pretty stark problems here, I would say.
Yeah, if, oh, they got it there. You can see the two peaks there. Those are hourly concentrations, and on the left is the value during the El Dorado National Forest fire. It was back in 1992. And at that time, this is the graphic that really made a believer out of me. I was, when that fire happened, we had a lot of people calling our office. They wanted to know, should we keep the kids indoors? Should we let them go out for PE? The description I got was that the sun was being blocked out by smoke, and ash particles were raining down on the town of Truckee, and people were very concerned, and it was very dramatic for them, all the smoke. And then I looked at a few days later, I looked at the numbers on our instrument, and I thought, gee, yeah, those are pretty high numbers. I wonder how that compares to a winter's day. And when I looked, I was shocked to see that it was not only the same, but actually a little bit less than a typical winter's day.
So again, the viewers that were looking at your screen, those dark boxes represented the typical January day, and the light boxes represented the El Dorado fire, but those peaks.
Those peaks were the same, and the daily average on that day, over the whole day, all the particulate averaged over the day was 121 micrograms per cubic meter, and that's the way we express PM10 concentrations. It's micrograms, a millionth of a gram in a cubic meter of air. On a typical January day, it's 124 micrograms per cubic meter. And in January of 1992, you got up to 179 micrograms per cubic meter.
And is that primarily wood stove emissions that we're talking about?
On many of those days, yes. And on some of those days, it's wind. And again, it depends on the time of year and the weather conditions. But when I looked at that graph, the reason during the fire it looked so dramatic was because those particles were very large. Those were the large particles, even though they were carried aloft and transported in from many miles away, and ash was raining down, it looked worse than it really was from a particulate matter standpoint, from respirable particles. During January, the air quality on many days is just as bad on typical January day. It's just as bad as during a forest fire, but it's not as dramatic because the particles are so small you don't see them. What those really small particles tend to do is they scatter the light and they create this general haze. So you look out over Truckee and you see this general haze. Well, that's those really small particles scattering the light, and that's why it's good to have instruments to actually objectively measure what's in the air instead of trying to make that guess just by looking outside.
And what are some of the health impacts that we're talking about here?
Well, again, it gets down into the lungs, so anybody who's got emphysema, asthma, some allergy sufferers, they're all going to be breathing these particles, and they're all going to be in the lungs, and they're there to stay. Another thing about particulate, when I mentioned, think of a grain of sand, but really small, we also have other types of particles that are aerosol particles, and those are gases, combustion gases, that have condensed into cool air to form little droplets. You know, you have a little spray bottle and you see all these droplets. Well, those are aerosol particles. Well, some of those particles, they condense and they don't evaporate in the cold air, and they act just like a regular particle, and they become respirable also.
And if I could expand upon that, particulate matter generally affects children, the elderly, and those with respiratory ailments the most. And what we see even increased death rates.
Sure, you're looking at a
from
severe
particulate matter.
economic as well as personal impact
That's
on
correct.
that. And you can see that when you're driving over the summit and coming into Truckee, especially on a winter's day. You can see that inversion layer, and you were talking about that inversion layer a little bit earlier,
Right.
Joe.
Right. The thing about an inversion layer is if the inversion layer is really high, you've got lots of room for those particulates to dilute. So the concentrations on the ground are not going to be as high. When that inversion layer drops down, then it's kind of like you and me smoking a cigar in a closet as compared to smoking a cigar in the Astrodome. You make that airspace really small, and suddenly the concentrations go way up, and it can become unbearable. That's part of why LA and Sacramento suffer so much, is those inversion layers trap everything.
In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what can be done to help mitigate some of this, what the town is doing, and what individuals can do. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the EPA agency and some of the things that they monitor right now. Now, they have an Office of Air Quality which designates non-attainment areas. My understanding is that a non-attainment area is that in which air quality consistently does not comply with federal standards. Now, on that non-attainment list are South Lake Tahoe and Reno, Nevada, which are on either side of us. Could that have a potential impact on us, and what does that mean in terms of the town of Truckee complying?
I would not think that Reno and South Lake Tahoe would have much of an impact, if any impact, on Truckee, because you'd have to transport that pollutant up over the mountain ranges and down into Truckee, and that's possible, but not likely. And it's my understanding that South Lake Tahoe is non-attainment for carbon monoxide, and I'm not sure about particulate. In Reno, I think it's carbon monoxide and particulate, PM10.
And really, in Truckee, we're talking about the issue being particulate matter,
Correct.
that's our largest problem.
Correct. And most of the year, the winds are moving out of the west and the southwest in Truckee. That's your, on average, that's where the wind comes from. And so you're not going to get particulate from Reno transported eastward, not very often.
Up over the ridge and
Up
into
over,
Truckee.
yeah, it's just not going to happen. So those areas are going to have minimal impact on
Well,
Truckee.
that's good, because it looks like we've got enough of our own issues without anybody else impacting them.
But those areas are similar to Truckee, and that's why they have those problems.
And in regards to the EPA standards, that was primarily one reason why the Air Quality District and the town decided to do this air quality management plan, although it's not mandated by either the state or the federal government, because between 1992 and 1994, we were getting very close to exceeding federal standards and getting close to possibly being designated non-attainment. So we decided to take a proactive stance and say, let's try to reduce our particulate matter emissions so we are not designated non-attainment. And the importance of that is with this plan being done by the Air Quality District and the town, we have local control over how we want to solve this problem. If a jurisdiction is designated non-attainment by the Environmental Protection Agency, then you have the EPA stepping in with certain mandates that you must do. So we decided to be proactive. Let's solve the problem now before it becomes serious.
That's great. One of the things, Dwayne, that we're going to be talking about also in the second half of the show are the mitigation funds coming from the UP merger, and we'll have a chance to talk about that. I'd like to just swing back to particulate matter one more time if I can, because I'd like to find out specifically what are some sources. I know you mentioned road dust and we've talked about wood stove, but what are some of the sources that we're dealing with in particular here in Truckee?
I think you just named them. Wood stoves. There is some open burning, but there's not a lot. You've got wind-blown dust from when they gravel the roads and sand the roads, and that gets pulverized and that gets entrained into the air. You've got open dirt areas like the railroad tracks. You've got a large dirt area that's east of town, and when the wind comes out of the east, we notice it on our instrument as the particulate levels go up. And those are the primary. There are others. There's automobile exhaust, diesel exhaust. The train is a small contribution. It's very difficult to apportion blame to any particular source accurately. We can only make generalizations.
Okay. Well, plus I would think that the topography of our area lends itself to that. We are in somewhat of a bowl here.
Yeah, and right, weather is a very important determinant in that, and so we see most of our poor air quality periods during the winter months. And the two major sources are wood stoves and what we call re-entrained road dust, which is dust being kicked up from the highways and the roads, especially after snow, when sand is put down for traction. And then for the next 4 days after that, you'll see a significant amount of dust being kicked up in the air as the vehicles crush the dust and it's brought up into the air.
Make it even finer. Make it into that little tiny dot. Okay, we are going to come back. We're going to take just a quick break right now. We are talking about air quality here today on Truckee Talks. Please stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
Leaves are turning, needles are falling, and El Nino is on the way. Get ready for winter at Mountain Hardware and Sports. Arian snowblowers are American-made for Sierra snow conditions. Winter wear from Columbia and Helly Hansen will keep you warm and dry for work or play. Mountain Hardware can help winterize your car and home with shovels, sealants, snow poles, and tire chains. For fun, rent or own snowshoes by Sherpa and Red Feather, and snow play accessories like hats and gloves. Winterize with the help of Mountain Hardware and Sports in Truckee.
American Mail Center offers a multitude of services for all your postal shipping needs. Notary public, copy service, fax service, order business cards, rubber stamp, signs and banners, shipping supplies and shipping by FedEx, UPS, or postal, and mailbox rentals. Act now with a 6-month rental. Get 2 months free or 1,000 business cards. Rent for 1 year and get both. Come to American Mail Center under the American flag in Gateway Center, Truckee.
Welcome back to the show. We're talking about air quality in Truckee, or perhaps the lack of it. Dwayne Hall is with us. This is Joe Fish. Welcome back to the show, gentlemen. We were talking off break about being proactive. You had mentioned that earlier in the show, being proactive about mitigating some of the pollution problems that we may have here in Truckee. And you had mentioned that that's probably a really good thing for the town to be. Do you want to elaborate a little on that, Joe?
Well, first, I'd like to commend Dwayne and the town of Truckee, because that is a smart thing to do, to be proactive. The state and the feds get involved. Quite frankly, they're going to screw it up. They're going to come in with a sledgehammer to swat a fly, and they're going to make a mess of everything, and nobody would benefit from that. And it's just the way they operate. We've seen it time and time again. So the smart thing for the town of Truckee to do is to take action now to solve their own problem in a way that's tailored to this particular situation, and not use a cookie cutter approach to a unique situation which Truckee has.
Sure,
So.
and we are. And Dwayne, you're of the opinion that we can actually make a difference now, that we can mitigate some of the problems we're having.
Yes, and the town council, as part of the general plan, has started to go in that direction. And one of the first things that they did as part of the general plan was, let's not make the situation worse. And there's specific general plan policies which states that new development needs to offset or mitigate its particulate matter emissions. So don't make the existing problem worse, and now we can focus on the current emissions and the existing sources through this air quality management plan.
Okay, let's talk about some of those existing sources, and the big one that comes to mind is sanding the roads. We can't do without it, and we can't live with it. How are we going to deal with this?
That is a difficult situation, and the Air Quality Management Plan Citizens Advisory Committee that was appointed by the Town Council to put together this Air Quality Management Plan ran up against this problem, and it's going to be very difficult, because in doing our calculations, we think that around 90% of the emissions from the road dust actually comes from Interstate 80 and the state highways, and that comes under the purview of Caltrans and their operations. And Caltrans is an agency whose number one purpose is to provide traffic safety and road safety, and so we need to work with Caltrans to see if there is any way that we can reduce their road sanding to try to reduce these re-entrained road dust emissions. So that is going to be a major task for the town in working with the state agency.
Is there a possible non-polluting alternative to sand? And I'm not sure even what that would be, but...
There are some methods, including the use of de-icers and controlling when and how much you sand. But with traffic expected to increase, I believe it's 80% within the next 20 years on these state highways, it's going to be a task just to keep the emissions from the highways at where they are right now.
At the same level or less,
That's
which
correct.
seems pretty tough to do. Are either of you aware of any pending legislation in the state of California? I know this has come up and then been brought back down again regarding wood stove emissions and outlawing wood stoves if they don't have catalytic converters. Or are you familiar with any kind of pending legislation like that? That would have a tremendous impact on our town for the number of people that use wood stoves for heat.
No, I'm not aware of any state legislation. You do have the Environmental Protection guidelines as to new wood stoves which are being constructed are a phase 2, which has lower emissions than some of the wood stoves that were created prior to 1990.
Okay.
But generally, the wood stove emissions are taken care of at the local level, and trying to remove some of these older wood stoves and replace them either with gas wood stoves or phase 2 wood stoves.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because one of the things that we've heard about is the Great Wood Stove Change-Out Program. What is that? Are you familiar with that?
It's a program that's going to be implemented early next year, and it's a joint cooperation between private wood stove manufacturers and distributors, the Air Quality District, and the Town of Truckee. in trying to remove all these wood stoves and replace them with either phase 2 or gas wood stoves by offering discounts, possibly building permit fee waivers, also other rebates. And that is something that's going to be occurring from January 15th to the end of February, and hopefully by next month we'll have a much better idea of what kind of incentives we can be offering homeowners if they want to exchange their wood stoves.
That's great. There are certainly enough houses in our area that rely on the older wood stoves. I know mine was up until this last month, primarily dependent on a large, out-of-date wood stove. And you just hated to use it, and you couldn't not use it. You needed heat for the house. Let's talk a little bit about an advisory committee, and Dwayne, you'll probably have to speak to that. Do we have an advisory committee for air quality here in town?
We do. It was created by the town council at the end of 1995 to work with air quality and town staff on putting together this air quality management plan. It has a wide range of people with varied backgrounds and experiences, including representatives from the wood stove industry, general citizens, also those with environmental backgrounds. And the purpose of that was to try to give a wide focus to this air quality management plan on what is the best way that we can tackle particulate matter air pollution in the most cost-efficient and non-regulatory manner that we can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you've come up with some ideas, or how long has this advisory committee been in?
The advisory committee has completed its preliminary review. Right now I am putting together the air quality management plan based upon their direction, and we anticipate having that available by the beginning of January, which will list the committee's findings and their recommended implementation measures, which will eventually will go to the town council.
Well, now this brings up another question, which is the Union Pacific merger. The town worked proactively with the UP to mitigate some of the impacts that the merger would have on our town. And one of the things the town was able to negotiate was $300,000 in air quality mitigation. Do we know where that money is going to be used or how it's going to be used?
One of the key components of the air quality management plan is having a financial incentive program to provide some financial assistance to homeowners who do want to get rid of their uncertified wood stoves and either convert to natural gas and get a gas wood stove or get a phase 2 wood stove. Mm-hmm. And we see this money from Union Pacific as being the seed money for this financial assistance program, which gives us a step up over other municipalities where they don't have the money or they must take the money from other areas. So we have that money. We're going to be using a portion of that money for this great wood stove change-out program, mm-hmm. and then further along the town, along with the Placer County Air Pollution Control District, because there are wood stoves in Martis Valley which affect Truckee, and putting that together and having a financial assistance program that will last for years and years to come.
That's great. That's good use of funds. Joe, let's do a temperature-taking question. You've worked with other towns. Truckee isn't the only town that your area covers. Are we doing it right?
I would say so, yeah. I'm that's not my, from what I've seen, from what I've observed. Quincy, a few years back, did the same thing when their problem got so bad. They were on a smaller scale than Truckee. Smaller town, smaller area. They banned open burning except for 2 months out of the year, mm-hmm. and they started a wood stove replacement program.
Okay.
And because they needed to. They did that. They came to us and wanted help with that. And Truckee's, they're doing the smart thing.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that, because we keep talking about wood stoves and sand, and the only times we really get those are during the winter. Dwayne, you had also brought in another graphic, and we'll ask to go to that graphic right now. That graphic shows us particulate matter, or PM10 concentrations average per month, and you can really see that spike up there. The first 3 notches are January, February, and March. So it's probably no surprise to anybody that lives in town because you can see the pollution, but that certainly is a dramatic difference. Does that follow along most towns that would be considered similar to Truckee in terms of snow country living?
That's your classic graph for anybody who's like an inverted bell.
Okay.
Anybody who's got a wood stove problem has that graph.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the winter months are really our biggest challenge, and it sounds like we're dealing with those proactively. Uh, Upcoming events, air quality management plan. You talked about that, and you said that you're nearly ready to present that to the town. Is that?
Well, I will be having a draft, and I will be submitting that back to the advisory committee, and they will be reviewing that. And after they're through, they will be making a recommendation in the form of that plan, which will go into to the town council. And as part of that, we will be having public hearings and public workshops, so the public can understand exactly what the problem is and how proposes to address that problem. And then ultimately it will go to the town council for their review and adoption, and that is only the first step. Once the air quality management plan is adopted, there's a number of implementation measures which we would need to follow up on, including putting together this financial assistance program, putting together a public education program, because that's a key, making sure people understand how to properly use their wood stoves and the advantages of having a Phase 2 wood stove over an uncertified wood stove.
Okay. What's the timeline on that? What are we looking at over the next year, 2 years?
I believe that we'll be having the public workshops and the town council review sometime middle of next year. But the draft plan should be available in January, and any member of the public would be able to come into my office and ask for that, and they would be able to take a look at what is being proposed.
Great, and that's at Town Hall. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to ask if there's any easy or quick or painless solutions right now that individuals can be doing to help keep the PM or particulate matter count down in Truckee.
Go ahead, Dwayne.
I think the one, probably the most important, is if you do have a wood stove, you need to learn how to operate it efficiently. And also in regards to the types of woods, using a mixture of softwoods and hardwoods is best. Hardwoods tend to have a greater heating efficiency than softwoods and produce less particulate matter. Also, you want your wood to be seasoned. You don't want green wood. And just things like that. And also, as part of this Great Wood Stove Changeout program, just start looking into it, because although you may have an uncertified wood stove now, and you may not have the money or be tight on money on getting a Phase 2 wood stove, understanding that a Phase wood stove is much more efficient and is probably going to save you money in regards to fuel and
Over
wood
the long run.
over the long run.
Okay. All right. Dwayne, Joe, thank you both very much for being on the show. You brought us a lot of good information. Maybe not good news right now, but it's nice to know we're doing something about it, and that's good to hear. Thank you both for being on the show.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on Truckee Talks. As an aside, Truckee Talks is looking for volunteers to help produce or put together shows. If you're interested, please call John Eccles at 582-1194. And thank you for joining us on the show.